You put your hands on me one more time, and I promise you, every person in this room becomes a witness to a federal crime." Gemma Holloway's voice didn't rise. It didn't waver. It dropped low and precise, like the click of a hammer being pulled back on a loaded revolver. School Resource Officer Hank Crowder froze mid-reach, his thick fingers still hovering inches from her arm. His jaw clenched, his nostrils flared. Behind him, Principal Warren Tully stood with his arms crossed over his chest, a smug, satisfied grin plastered across his flushed face, fully expecting his uniformed enforcer to drag this woman out of the auditorium like yesterday's trash. He had no idea that in the next 45 minutes, his career, his reputation, and his freedom would be stripped from him piece by piece, in front of the very community he had terrorized for over a decade. The Crestwood Academy auditorium smelled the way every public school auditorium in America smells. Industrial floor cleaner, stale recycled air, and the faint chemical sweetness of laminated paper-shade signs taped to the cinder block walls. The overhead fluorescent tubes cast a flat, unflattering light that made everyone look a shade sicker than they actually were. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, and the folding metal chairs arranged in tight rows were about 2/3 full. Roughly 140 parents, teachers, a handful of school board members, and a scattering of local press from the Ridgemont Courier, the only newspaper that still bothered covering school board meetings in this mid-sized Virginia suburb. The meeting had been called to address what the district euphemistically labeled recent disciplinary actions, but everyone in the room knew exactly what it was really about. 3 black students had been suspended in the span of 2 weeks, all from the same honors program, all on charges so flimsy they practically dissolved under scrutiny. One girl, 14 years old, was suspended for dress code violation because her braids had small gold beads at the ends. A 16-year-old boy was removed from AP chemistry for insubordination after he corrected his teacher's molar mass calculation, politely, in front of the class. And then there was Isaiah Holloway, 14, straight A student, starting point guard on the junior varsity basketball team. Isaiah had been given a 5-day out-of-school suspension and a permanent disciplinary mark on his academic record for threatening and aggressive behavior. His crime: he had raised his voice in the hallway when he saw a smaller 6th grader, a shy kid named Devon, who had a speech impediment, being shoved against a locker by 2 older boys. Isaiah stepped between them. He told the bullies to back off. A teacher rounded the corner, saw only a tall black teenager with his voice raised and his hands up, and called security without asking a single question. Gemma Holloway sat in the 4th row, left side of the center aisle. She had arrived early, deliberately choosing with a clear sightline to the stage, the exits, and the school resource officer's usual station, near the double doors. She was wearing a simple navy blue sundress, flat sandals, and a thin gold chain with a small pendant shaped like the scales of justice, a gift from her late mother. She carried a canvas tote bag that had seen better days, stuffed with what appeared to be grocery store coupons and a dog-eared paperback novel. Her hair was pulled back in a low, neat bun. No makeup. No jewelry besides the chain. She looked, by careful and deliberate design, like any other working mother who had rushed to the meeting, straight from a long day. This was intentional. Everything about Gemma Holloway was intentional. What nobody in that auditorium knew, except for her 14-year-old son sitting rigidly beside her, with his hands clasped in his lap and his eyes fixed on the scuffed floor, was that Gemma Holloway was a senior litigation partner at Ashford, Kincaid & Roll, one of the most feared civil rights law firms in Washington, D.C. She had graduated magna cum laude from Howard University, earned her Juris Doctor from Harvard Law, and clerked for a Supreme Court justice before she turned 28. Over the past 15 years, she had personally argued 11 cases before federal appellate courts and won 9 of them. Her specialty was institutional discrimination, specifically the kind of quiet, systemic racism that embedded itself in school disciplinary policies, hiring practices, and housing codes, the kind designed to be invisible to anyone who wasn't its target. She had argued before panels of federal judges who interrupted her and tried to rattle her composure. She had been screamed at by opposing counsel in depositions that lasted 9 hours. She had once calmly cross-examined a police chief until he contradicted his own sworn affidavit 3 times in 12 minutes. The man sitting on that stage behind the folding table, the one with the cheap navy blazer and the American flag pin and the self-important expression, did not remotely register on her threat assessment. Principal Warren Tully had run Crestwood Academy for 11 years. He was 56, paunchy, with thinning sandy hair combed carefully over a widening bald spot and a perpetually ruddy complexion that deepened to an alarming crimson whenever he felt his authority was being questioned, which was often. Before Crestwood, he had bounced between 3 different school districts in 2 states, each departure quietly negotiated after patterns of complaints that never quite reached the threshold of formal investigation. The Ridgemont School Board had hired him because he was cheap, because he projected an image of old-school discipline that appealed to certain vocal parents, and because nobody on the board had bothered to make more than a single reference call. Under Tully's regime, Crestwood's suspension rate for black students had tripled, not gradually. It spiked in his second year and never came back down. He had implemented a zero-tolerance behavioral code that, on paper, applied to all students equally. In practice, it functioned as a precision instrument of selective enforcement. White students who got into shoving matches at recess received conflict resolution counseling. Black students who raised their voices in the hallway received suspensions that went on their permanent records, the kind that followed them to college applications, scholarship reviews, and job interviews for years to come. Tully called it maintaining standards. Parents called it what it was. His enforcer was School Resource Officer Hank Crowder. Crowder was 44, built like a retired linebacker who had stopped working out but kept eating like he hadn't. He stood 6'2", 250 pounds, with a shaved head and a permanent expression that hovered somewhere between boredom and barely restrained hostility. He had been a deputy with the Ridgemont County Sheriff's Office for 9 years before being reassigned to school duty after an incident involving an excessive force complaint from a traffic stop that the department settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. Galiosite. The reassignment was supposed to be a cooling-off period. Instead, it gave Crowder a building full of children who couldn't fight back and a principal who encouraged his worst instincts. He wore his full tactical belt to school every single day, including his department-issued Glock 19, his taser, his pepper spray, and a pair of steel handcuffs. For a middle school, the meeting had been droning on for nearly an hour when the public comment period finally opened. Tully presided from the center of the stage, flanked by 2 visibly uncomfortable school board members, Dr. Patricia Nguyen and a retired accountant named Bill Hutchins, both of whom seemed to be studying their own fingernails with great intensity. A district spokesperson sat at the end of the table with a legal pad, taking notes that nobody would ever read. The first few parents who approached the microphone were cautious. They spoke in generalities. They used phrases like concerned about consistency and hoping for more transparency. They were terrified, and it showed. Tully nodded along with practiced, condescending patience, occasionally interjecting with phrases like, "I appreciate your passion, and we always welcome constructive dialogue," each word dripping with the unmistakable subtext that the conversation was entirely decorative, and nothing said in this room would change a single thing. Then Gemma stood up. She didn't rush. She placed her tote bag neatly on her chair, touched Isaiah's shoulder once, a brief, grounding contact that communicated everything without a word, and walked calmly to the standing microphone in the center aisle. She adjusted it to her height. She took a single, measured breath, and then she began speaking in a voice so clear, so controlled, and so surgically precise that the low murmur of side conversations in the auditorium died within seconds. "Good evening. My name is Gemma Holloway. My son Isaiah is a 9th grader here at Crestwood. He was suspended 5 days ago for the act of protecting a younger student from physical bullying. I've reviewed the incident report filed by the attending teacher, and I'd like to point out 3 specific factual errors in that document. First, the report states that Isaiah initiated a physical confrontation. Security camera footage from hallway camera, C7, which I have formally requested through a FOIA filing with the district, will show that Isaiah positioned himself between the victim and 2 aggressors. He did not make physical contact with anyone. Second, the report claims the responding teacher witnessed the beginning of the altercation. Shift logs show that teacher was not in the hallway until 45 seconds after the incident began. She witnessed nothing but the aftermath. Third, the report classifies Isaiah's behavior as threatening and aggressive. Under Virginia Education Code Section .1277, threatening behavior requires a demonstrable intent to cause harm. Raising one's voice to say, "Leave him alone," does not meet that statutory threshold. The silence in the auditorium was absolute. Parents turned in their seats to look at her. Dr. Nguyen's head snapped up from her fingernail inspection. Even Bill Hutchins put down his pen. On the stage, Warren Tully's composure cracked for exactly 1 second. A micro-expression, visible only to those watching closely, flickered across his face. It wasn't concern, it wasn't even surprise. It was something closer to fury. The deep, nauseating fury of a man who was accustomed to people stammering, apologizing, and backing down the moment he furrowed his brow. This woman wasn't stammering. She was citing statute numbers from memory. Tully leaned into his microphone. "Mrs. Holloway, I appreciate your thoroughness, but this is a public comment period, not a legal proceeding. We're here to listen to concerns, not to relitigate individual disciplinary cases on the floor. If you have specific grievances regarding your son's situation, I'd encourage you to schedule a private meeting with my office." "I've attempted to schedule a meeting with your office 4 times in 5 days, Gemma replied, without a trace of agitation. "Your administrative assistant informed me that your calendar was full through November. I have the emails documented. I also have the emails from 11 other parents in this room who received the same response when they attempted to discuss their children's suspensions. Would you like me to read the dates and times into the public record?" A ripple of murmuring swept through the audience. Several parents nodded. 2 women in the back row began recording on their phones. Tully's face went from its usual ruddy pink to a deep, mottled scarlet. The American flag pin on his lapel seemed to tremble with the effort of containing his rage. He turned to Crowder, who was standing against the wall near the emergency exit with his thumbs hooked into his belt, and gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Crowder pushed himself off the wall and began walking toward Gemma. His heavy boots echoed against the linoleum with each deliberate, intimidating step. He positioned himself to her left, slightly behind her, close enough that she could smell the sharp mint of his breath and the chemical scent of gun oil from his holster. "Ma'am," Crowder said, dropping his voice to a low, authoritative register designed to sound reasonable to the audience, while communicating something very different to its target. "Your allotted comment time has expired. I'm going to need you to return to your seat." "My allotted time is 3 minutes, Gemma said, not turning to look at him. "I've been speaking for 90 seconds. The timer is displayed on the screen behind you." She was right. The digital countdown on the projection screen clearly read 1:31 remaining. Crowder glanced at Tully. Tully made the slightest motion with his chin. "Keep going." "Ma'am, the chair has determined that your comments are disruptive to the proceedings. You need to step away from the microphone and take your seat. Now." Crowder's voice hardened. He shifted his stance wider, squaring his shoulders, making his already considerable frame look even larger. His right hand drifted casually toward his belt, not to any specific tool, but to the general vicinity of everything clipped there. The gesture was unmistakable. It was a physical vocabulary he had perfected over years. "I have weapons, you don't. Comply or find out." Gemma turned her head slowly, just enough to make direct eye contact with Crowder. Her expression didn't change. Her breathing didn't quicken. She had been stared down by men far more dangerous than this one in settings where the stakes were measured in human lives and constitutional precedents, not parking lot jurisdictions and hall passes. "Officer, I am exercising my legal right to public comment at an open government meeting, as guaranteed under the Virginia Freedom of Information Act and the First Amendment. I am not being disruptive. I am not raising my voice. I am presenting documented facts. If you remove me from this microphone before my allotted time expires, you will be in direct violation of my civil rights, and I will be filing a formal complaint with the Ridgemont County Sheriff's Office, the Virginia Department of Education, and the ACLU before you finish your shift tonight." She said it the way a surgeon describes an incision. No anger. No bluster. Pure, factual, clinical precision. And then she turned back to the microphone and continued speaking. "As I was saying, the pattern of disciplinary actions at this school raises serious questions about selective enforcement. In the last 3 academic years, black students at Crestwood, who represent 18% of the student body, have accounted for 71% of all out-of-school suspensions. I have the district's own data, obtained through a public records request filed 60 days ago. The disparity is not marginal. That's enough." Tully's voice cut through the room from the stage, stripped of any pretense of civility. He stood up from his chair, his palms flat on the table, leaning forward. Ms. Holloway, you are out of order. You are turning a community forum into a personal attack against this administration. Officer Crowder, escort this woman out of the building. I am within my time. I am within my rights. I am not leaving. Gemma's voice remained level, but something in it shifted almost imperceptibly. It was the same shift a seasoned attorney makes when she stops presenting evidence and starts building the record for what comes next. Crowder moved. He didn't ask again. His left hand closed around Gemma's upper arm, gripping hard through the thin fabric of her sundress, his thick fingers digging into the muscle of her bicep with enough force to leave bruises. He pulled, yanking her sideways away from the microphone stand, which screeched against the floor with a sharp, metallic shriek. Isaiah shot to his feet in the fourth row, his face contorted with horror and helpless rage. "Don't touch my mom! Sit down, boy!" Crowder barked over his shoulder without releasing Gemma's arm. And then Gemma Holloway did something that Hank Crowder did not expect. She didn't scream, she didn't struggle, she didn't try to pull free. She went perfectly, completely still. The sudden absence of resistance was so disorienting that Crowder actually loosened his grip for a fraction of a second, confused by the lack of the panicked thrashing he was used to provoking. In that fraction of a second, Gemma turned her body toward him, looked him dead in the eyes, and spoke. Not to him, to the room. "My name is Gemma Holloway. I am being physically assaulted by a uniformed officer at a public government meeting for the act of reading documented statistics into the public record. I want every person in this room who is recording to please continue with SPAT. I want the school board members on that stage to note that Officer Hank Crowder has placed his hands on me without legal cause, without a lawful order to disperse, and without any provocation. I am not resisting. I am complying. I am documenting." Her voice carried to every corner of the silent auditorium. It was the voice of a woman who had delivered opening arguments in federal courtrooms where billions of dollars and hundreds of civil rights hung in the balance. It was a voice trained to reach the back row of a gallery without ever shouting, to project authority without aggression, to command attention through the sheer gravitational force of absolute, practiced composure. At least 15 phones were now recording. The reporter from the Ridgemont Courier had abandoned her notepad and was filming with her phone braced on a folding chair for stability, her mouth hanging slightly open. Crowder's face went from aggressive to uncertain to something approaching genuine panic in the span of about 4 seconds. He was trained to deal with people who fought back, who screamed, who gave him justification. He was not trained for this. He was not prepared for a woman who turned his own use of force into a public evidentiary hearing in real time. He released her arm and stepped back. "You need to leave," he said, but the conviction had drained from his voice like water from a cracked glass. "No," Gemma said. She calmly straightened the strap of her sundress, where his hand had twisted it. She stepped back to the microtimer. 47 seconds remaining. "In closing," she continued, her voice unwavering, "I want the board to know that I am not speaking tonight solely as a parent. I am speaking as legal counsel. I represent, pro bono, the families of all 3 students who were suspended in the past 2 weeks. I have already filed a formal civil rights complaint with the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. I have submitted the district's own disciplinary data, disaggregated by race, along with a pattern and practice analysis documenting violations of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The investigation is already open. Case number OCR 042411187. You are welcome to verify that with the regional office in the morning." She paused. The auditorium was so quiet that the electrical hum of the fluorescent lights sounded like a roar. "I also want the board to know that the events of the last 3 minutes, in which a uniformed officer physically assaulted a parent at a public meeting on the apparent verbal direction of the school principal, have been recorded by multiple witnesses and will be incorporated into the existing federal complaint as additional evidence of retaliation against a complainant. Under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, both Officer Crowder and Principal Tully may now face personal civil liability for the deprivation of my constitutional rights under color of state authority." She cited the statute number the way most people recite their home address. From memory, without effort, like breathing. Then she turned, walked calmly back to her seat, sat down next to her son, and placed her hands flat on her lap. The timer on the screen behind the stage blinked to 0. On the stage, Warren Tully stood frozen in a posture that would have been almost comical under different circumstances. His mouth was partially open. His hands were still pressed flat against the table. The crimson had drained completely from his face, replaced by a grey, waxy pallor. Next to him, Dr. Nguyen was staring at Gemma with an expression that was equal parts shock, admiration, and the dawning, sickening realization that she had been sitting on this board for 3 years, watching this happen and doing nothing. Bill Hutchins leaned slowly toward his microphone. His voice was shaky. I think we should take a 15-minute recess." "No," Dr. Nguyen said, suddenly and sharply. It was the first word she had spoken all evening with any force behind it. "No recess. I want to hear from every parent who signed up for public comment tonight. Every single one. And I want the district's legal counsel on the phone in this room within the hour." What happened next unfolded with the slow, inexorable gravity of a landslide. Over the following 90 minutes, 11 more parents approached the microphone. One by one, they told their stories. A mother whose 12-year-old daughter was suspended for defiance because she asked to use the bathroom a second time during a 3-hour testing block. A father whose son was pulled from the gifted program after Tully personally intervened, claiming the boy's standardized test scores were anomalous and demanding a retest that was never administered to any white student who scored similarly. A grandmother raising her 2 grandchildren, both of whom had been assigned to in-school suspension on the same day for dress code violations that she could prove, with photographs other students committed daily without consequence. Each story was more damning than the last, and each parent, emboldened by what they had just witnessed, spoke with a clarity and courage that surprised even themselves. Something had shifted in the room. The invisible architecture of fear that Tully had spent a decade constructing, the unspoken understanding that challenging him would only make things worse for your child, had been demolished in 3 minutes by a woman in a sundress with a canvas tote bag. Tully attempted to regain control exactly once. After the 5th parent spoke, he leaned into his microphone and began, "I want to remind everyone that anecdotal complaints don't constitute." "Warren," Dr. Nguyen cut him off. Her voice was ice. "Stop talking. Right now." He stopped. By 9:47 p.m., the district's outside legal counsel, a visibly alarmed attorney named Helen Frazier, who had been patched in via speakerphone, recommended that the board immediately place both Principal Tully and Officer Crowder on administrative leave, pending a full independent investigation. Dr. Nguyen moved to adopt the recommendation. Bill Hutchins seconded it. The vote was 2-0, Tully having been informed that he was not permitted to vote on matters pertaining to his own disciplinary status, a fact he apparently had not known, which told everyone in the room everything they needed to know about how carefully he had been reading his own governance bylaws. Crowder was ordered to surrender his access badge and leave the building immediately. He stood near the exit for a long, humiliating moment, looking to Tully for some kind of rescue, some assertion of authority that would reset the power dynamics to their natural order. Tully wouldn't met his eyes. Crowder left alone, his boots echoing down the empty hallway, the sound growing fainter until it was swallowed by the heavy click of the exterior door. But the real unraveling didn't happen that night. It happened over the following weeks, and then months, and each new development hit harder than the last. The cell phone videos from the meeting were uploaded to social media before the parking lot had emptied. By morning, the footage of Crowder grabbing Gemma's arm while she calmly narrated her own assault had been viewed over 2 million times. The Ridgemont Courier, which hadn't broken a story that mattered in years, published a front-page investigation within 72 hours, having spent the previous 2 months sitting on a tip they'd been too cautious to pursue. The tip had come from a former Crestwood teacher who had resigned in protest. The Courier's investigation confirmed what Gemma's federal complaint had alleged. Under Tully's administration, black students at Crestwood were suspended at 3.8 times the rate of white students for comparable infractions, and in many cases, identical. The Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights moved with unusual speed. Within 3 weeks, they dispatched a 4-person investigative team to Ridgemont. They reviewed 5 years of disciplinary records, interviewed 46 parents, 22 teachers, and 9 current and former staff members. What they found was worse than anyone had publicly alleged. Tully hadn't merely been selectively enforcing the code of conduct. He had been actively coaching certain teachers on how to write incident reports that would justify harsher penalties for targeted students. Emails recovered from his district account showed explicit instructions. Make sure the language reflects physical aggression, even if it's just verbal. The word threatening goes a long way in the appeals process. The federal investigation also uncovered that Tully had personally intervened to block 3 separate internal complaints filed by teachers who had raised concerns about racial disparities. In each case, the complaining teacher was subsequently given unfavorable schedule assignments, denied professional development opportunities, or pressured to transfer. One teacher, a 23-year veteran named Mrs. Gloria Stamper, had been forced into early retirement after Tully placed a fabricated performance improvement plan in her personnel file. Her offense: she had sent an email to the school board questioning why every student removed from the honors track that year was black. Warren Tully was terminated by unanimous vote of the school board 6 weeks after the meeting. He was escorted from the building by a district security officer, not Crowder, who by that point was dealing with his own accelerating catastrophe. Tully carried a single cardboard box containing his personal effects: a coffee mug, a framed photo of himself shaking hands with a state senator, and the American flag pin he had worn on his lapel every single day for 11 years, which he left sitting on his former desk, apparently by accident. Hank Crowder fared worse. The Ridgemont County Sheriff's Office, facing a public relations firestorm, opened an internal affairs investigation that quickly expanded beyond the school meeting incident. The investigation revealed that Crowder had amassed 14 formal complaints during his 9 years as a deputy, 7 of which involved allegations of excessive force against Black or Latino residents. All 14 had been internally adjudicated and dismissed, each time with the same 3-word finding: within department policy. The sheriff, facing mounting pressure from the County Board of Supervisors, fired Crowder 3 weeks after the meeting, citing conduct unbecoming. But the termination was a firebreak, not justice. Justice came from a different direction entirely. The Ridgemont County Commonwealth's attorney, after reviewing the cell phone footage and the school's own security camera recordings, charged Hank Crowder with simple assault and battery, a misdemeanor that normally carried minimal consequences. But Gemma Holloway had not spent 15 years winning federal civil rights cases by settling for minimum consequences. She filed a separate federal civil rights lawsuit under Section 1983 against Crowder, Tully, and the Ridgemont County School District on behalf of all 3 suspended students and their families. The suit alleged systematic racial discrimination in disciplinary enforcement, retaliatory suppression of complaints, and the use of law enforcement as a tool of racial intimidation within a public educational institution. The damages sought were substantial enough to make the district's insurance carrier immediately push for settlement negotiations. The case never went to trial. It didn't need to. The evidence was so overwhelming, so meticulously documented, so thoroughly corroborated by the federal investigation and the district's own recovered emails, that the school district settled for $4.2 million, distributed among the affected families, with a binding consent decree requiring the complete overhaul of Crestwood's disciplinary policies, mandatory bias training for all staff, the installation of an independent ombudsman, and the permanent expungement of every racially tainted disciplinary record from every affected student's file. Isaiah Holloway's suspension was formally rescinded. His record was wiped clean. The school board issued a public letter of apology to his family, read aloud at a board meeting by Dr. Nguyen herself, who had by then been elected board chair and had spent every waking hour since the October meeting trying to rebuild what Tully had spent a decade destroying. Hank Crowder pleaded no contest to the assault charge, received a suspended sentence, and was permanently barred from law enforcement employment in the Commonwealth of Virginia. His name was added to the state's decertification database, a quiet, bureaucratic entry that would follow him to every job application for the rest of his professional life. Warren Tully was never criminally charged. He didn't need to be. The consent decree named him personally. The federal report named him personally. The Courier's investigation, which was later picked up by the Washington Post, named him personally. His teaching license was revoked by the Virginia Board of Education. His carefully maintained LinkedIn profile, which had listed educational leadership and student achievement among his top skills, was quietly deleted. He moved out of Ridgemont within the year. Where he went, nobody particularly cared to find out. On the day the settlement was announced, Gemma Holloway stood outside the Ridgemont County Courthouse, flanked by the families she represented, and gave a brief statement to the gathered press. She wore the same navy sundress, the same flat sandals, the same thin gold chain, with the scales of justice pendant. She spoke for less than 2 minutes. She thanked the families for their courage. She thanked Dr. Nguyen for choosing accountability over complicity. She thanked the investigators for doing their jobs. She did not mention Warren Tully or Hank Crowder by name. She did not gloat. She did not perform outrage. She made a single point, and she made it with the same lethal, quiet species that had defined every moment of this fight from the beginning. My son was suspended for protecting a child. He was punished for showing courage. Tonight, he knows that the system can be held accountable, not because his mother is an attorney, not because cameras were rolling, but because the facts were documented, the law was applied, and ordinary people in this community refused to look away. That shouldn't be extraordinary. That should be Tuesday. Isaiah, standing behind her with his hands in the pockets of his khakis, looked at his mother with an expression that no camera fully captured, but every parent in the crowd immediately recognized. It wasn't just pride, although it was certainly that. It was the look of a young man who had watched the most powerful forces in his small world try to crush the people he loved, and had seen those forces lose, not because of violence, not because of status, but because one woman sat down at a microphone, spoke the truth calmly and precisely, and refused to stop until the truth did what truth does when you give it enough room. 6 months later, the Crestwood Academy Gymnasium was renamed the Gloria Stamper Gymnasium, in honor of the veteran teacher who had been forced out for speaking up. Mrs. Stamper, 71 years old and sharp as a razor, cut the ribbon herself, surrounded by 2 decades worth of former students who had driven from 3 different states to be there. Gemma didn't attend the ceremony. She was in a federal courthouse in Richmond, representing a family of 4 whose landlord had been retaliating against them for reporting black mold in their apartment. She was wearing a grey blazer and reading glasses, standing calmly at a podium, citing statute numbers from memory, without looking at her notes, doing exactly what she had always done and would always do, holding the powerful accountable with nothing but the documented truth, and an unshakable refusal to be silenced, no matter how loudly they shouted, no matter how hard they grabbed, no matter how desperately they wanted her to just sit down and be quiet. She never sat down. She never would.